This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. With me this week are two fantastic human beings, Tia Vassiliou.
Hello.
And Nick White.
Hey.
Thank you both for joining me this week. I'm really excited because we've got a killer Kickstarter commissioned episode coming to you, and that's after the break. But before we get to all that, let me ask the question I ask pretty much every week. How have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Tia.
It's kind of been a week, let me tell you.
Okay.
It's been a week. Like, feels like everyone I know is sick, and I have been sleeping for like 15 hours a day.
Oh,
I don't
Lord.
know why. Yeah, it's just like something. I've been dreaming about comics, maybe, but I didn't get to read as many as I really would have liked.
Okay.
So I'm only going to talk about one today, which was awesome, and that is Dazzler X-Song #1, which I think is just a one-shot, which makes me really sad. Maybe
Same.
that's why I had to take to my bed, because I was so sad that it's just a one-shot. like a lady in the 19th century whose corset is too tight.
Mm-hmm.
This is by Magdalene Visaggio, Laura Braga, and Rochelle Rosenberg, and oh my gosh. So, like, I don't know. I've always known about Dazzler. Like, she's cool. She, I guess, can turn sound into, like, a light force thing. I guess kind of like what Cyclops shoots out of his face? Tell me, Mike. I don't know.
Well, so Dazzler's powers are weird because they're very strictly based around turning sound into energy, right? Not
but
like a
light
Jubilee,
also,
but it's,
right?
it's light usually.
I think
but
Tia, I'm
sometimes-
about to go sleep for 15 hours now. Just wake me up. Wake me up when Mike's... I mean, he won't be done in 15 hours, but you can let me know.
Listen, it's fine. I'll be very succinct about it. She turns sound into light energy, and sometimes it's concussive, sometimes it's not. She usually uses it to like jazz up her shows that she's performing. Like as she's performing music, she's like shooting light out of everything. It's cool. It's kind of like Jubilees, but cooler for some reason. I don't know. But Dazzler's fantastic.
It seemed from this one shot that it doesn't have to be her own sound that she's making.
Correct. It's any music.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty cool. Anyway, she's awesome. She is a pop star. She has this like super cool, colorful kind of gem vibe going on with pink hair.
Totally.
And, you know,
Totally outrageous.
Totally outrageous. In the story, there are a couple of girls who are fans, and they are Inhumans. Now, I'm just going to say up front, don't care about Inhumans, don't really care about X-Men, don't care about their beef with each other. I've not followed any of that. I like only in the most vague terms know what's going on with them and the like Terrigen mists, and they like don't like each other, and there were the fighting noises.
They're all the same. Yeah.
Like it's very Sharks and the Jets with the X people, the mutants and the Inhumans. They don't like each other.
With the snapping and the clapping and the...
It's true. There's the dance breaks. And so Dazzler's basically just like... Dazzler's like with me. She's like sitting on the couch with me being like, I don't give a crap about any of this fighting nonsense. Can we please just listen to music and... be cool. Just be cool, everybody.
Totally.
And I really maybe that's why I liked this so much, because I was like, Dazzler, I feel you. Or Allison, actually. So she's not even going by Dazzler. She's going by her actual name, which I thought was a really interesting like way in the story for her to put distance between her like ex-Sona. Is that a thing? Your ex-Sona?
It is now, because I fucking love that.
She's like, I'm just Allison. I'm just a pop star singing a song. And the problem is that there's these mutants who are like trying to gatekeep and sometimes be very violent about it and very like shitty and abusive towards Inhumans who are fans and try to come to Dazzler's shows or Allison shows. Mm-hmm. Actually, her band has the name, the Lightbringers. And so... What I really thought was interesting about this is Allison very explicitly is not having this shit. And it really reminded me of just everything that is going on in comics right now with like a small group of very shitty, loud people who are able to whip up other people in support of them because like they say a few things that maybe sounds like it sort of makes sense if you like squint at it, but really what it is extremely abusive, and they're really shitty to people who they've decided are, for whatever arbitrary reason, like not welcome there. And I think that it's important in real life for more comics creators to be very explicit about how that is not okay and they're not having it, and be really active in like not letting that seep into the spaces where they have some sort of power or where their like creative work lives. Like if they're against that, they need to keep that out because they're kind of the ones with the power. And I like how Dazzler Allison in the story is like, she keeps that out of her shows. Like she's not having it at all. And it's just, I think, a really nice way to be like, hey, look, here's what needs to be happening, everybody. Okay, good. Let's just be cool.
Yeah, it's such a good book. Like, what a great one-shot. Like, we rarely get good one-shots by the X-Men. I say that because I read one and it was really bad very recently. So I'm glad that this one kicked butt, because X-Men need that sometimes. At least my personal opinion. It's really interesting to me too that, you know, for so long in comics history, the X-Men were supposed to be this metaphor for, you know, outsiders, the downtrodden, the abused, like, and I think that very specifically in like Gamergate and Comicsgate and these like white supremacist spaces, people are trying to claim that as their identity and as their like experience and co-opt it in a way, and it's just like, no, man, stop that, you know? Yeah, I totally agree.
Well, it seems like this book really touches on the idea of how quickly the oppressed can transition into being the oppressor and the cognitive dissonance that comes along with that.
Oh, man. Yeah.
I don't know. I would be really actually careful about saying that because I don't necessarily, like, I don't...
Well, I'm saying it sounds like these X-Men, right? You're saying that you have mutants.
Well, it's not X-Men. There are mutants who are, like, pushing back against Inhumans.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's like you take two oppressed groups, in a way, and like one is just trying to pit their dominance over the other because they're different, quote unquote, gene freaks. Like, it is really rough, like to deal with that, because it was like, but that's not what mutants are all about. Like, there's this harmony in this, like, this, we are a group of people who can unite, like, for a better future. But like, that's the X-Men ideal. I don't know. I was very like torn about some of that, but I understand what was going on in the book, like what was happening. Just like, it seems so out of character for mutants to do that, but in my head, it's like, no, that's out of character for the X-Men. That they aren't the sole representative of all mutant kind in a way.
Yeah, I'm glad there's an expert here to weigh in to fill that in, because, you know, as I said, I just don't really follow the X-Men saga or the mutant or the Inhuman. You know, it's like it just kind of going on in the background. I know that it exists, but I think that's helpful insight. Anyway, it was great. How about you, Nick?
It's been a weird weekend. It was one of those weekends where I was supposed to catch up on sleep from having a sort of sleep deprived week, and didn't really happen. Weird times, man. Just got back from Solo. That was a movie. I'll reserve other thoughts, but there are things I'm just not having about this movie. I'll leave it at that. Other than that, I had some adventures. A friend who was out of town called me to tell me that he had left the hose filling his pool on the day before, and he's like, I need someone to go check on that. So that was something I got to do. I envisioned half of like the city block underwater, but things seem to be okay. So
Cape Town literally ran out of water like 3 months ago.
Yeah.
Well, now they're gonna have even less at this point.
So what'd you read, Nick?
Yeah,
tell me what you read.
Yeah, please.
Sure. Please tell me that it conforms to some normal standards in your life. Yes, thank you. So I read Harbinger Wars 2, number 1. That's right. This is the second Harbinger Wars, and it's the first issue of it. If there's anything I love about a comic, it's a super confusing, stupid title that really just jars people. So we're right off the bat, doing real well here. Written by Matt Kint, line work by Thomas Giarello, colors by Diego Rodriguez. As I said, yay for messy and convoluted titles. This issue had a tough act to follow because it follows Eric Hessier and Raoul Allen's Prelude issue, which was so good, so good. And, of course, that's the team from Secret Weapons. So this issue deals with the fallout from the Prelude, which I'll try to dance around enough here and say that Livewire may or may not have overreacted to some aggression towards Psiots, and a lot of the lights are out in America, and we'll leave it at that.
Okay.
That being said, people are taking sides, so yes, I understand the eye rolling, Nick. Geez, this sounds a lot like Civil War. People are going to be shoehorned in and have to go up against each other, blah, blah, blah. And I think, yeah, there's a bit of that. And I would go so far as to say, look, Civil War didn't invent that either. They were reinventing that wheel too. But what I find different is that Valiant has been slowly leading to this point for like a year and a half. And what I really like about Matt Kindt is that he's not doing what you see a lot with these, these guys are on this side and these guys are on that side, and we're just going to smash our action figures together until they fight or kiss or something's going to happen, right? Maybe both. He's very well understood that he's not going to shoehorn characters into acting in ways that would just be completely uncharacteristic. Ninjak has always worked for MI6. He's always worked for the military, but he has feelings for Livewire, so he's trying to tip her off and let her know people are looking for you. People that are more characters that operate in the gray are still sort of operating in the gray. Bloodshot, who of course was a government project, guess what? He really doesn't want to side with the government. So people are acting like they should. I appreciate that. Beyond that, yes, it does feel a little bombastic, and yes, it does feel like a summer event, which is fine, because that's what it is. The only other thing I would say is it's really, really weird to see the characters from Secret Weapons drawn by anyone other than Raoul Allen. And I think we've all seen this in comics before, where it's so weird to finally see someone you've always seen drawn by someone else, and you're like, I don't know about this.
Yeah.
Especially when you go from someone more cartoony and stylized like Allen to Thomas Giorello. So I read that. The other thing I just want to briefly touch on, I started Planetary Volume 1, written by Warren Ellis, drawn by John Cassaday, colors by Laura Martin and David Barron, two of my favorite colorists for Valiant. I'm not that far into this, but I think I'm mainly just using this book to puff my chest, and I'm sure people out there are like, you know what, we've got Nick pegged, Valiant, Dark Horse, and a decreasing amount of DC books as they piss him off. We've really figured him out, and I think a lot of this just goes into me really being more comfortable sitting down and really slowing down when I'm reading something like John Hickman and something like Warren Ellis, where if you don't, you're just sort of glazing over pictures where people are largely just talking. And so you really don't grasp what's going on. And to some credit, I will say, Mike has pushed these guys on me enough that I'm like, whatever, but I'll mainly take credit for it. I believe this is like a personal development of sorts, like a personal growth. So Mike was there, but he was secondary character, waiting in the wings.
Thanks, Nick.
Off to the side.
I'm glad to just show up,
Yeah, maybe we'll just hire a voice actor for your part. They won't even see you. They'll just hear you. So I think what works for me about Cassaday here is I'm so used to seeing him drawing Star Wars, which, yes, I know, he's drawn so many other things, but that's the thing I connect with him. I think he drew the first two arcs of the 2015 reboot, and I admit I wasn't real keen on Cassaday because I feel like he was like, you know what, I'm going to go for this sort of photorealistic look for Star Wars, and he was 90% of the way there, but then Luke's nose just looked a little weird, or just little things, you know what I mean? And it's at that point, just go with someone who either nails it, like Alex Ross, which I don't like Alex Ross, so don't do that, or just go hyper stylized, you know what I mean? If you read the K2SO and Cassian one shot, that was a really hyper stylized take by, I think, Fernando Blanco, and that worked, and I really liked that. So yeah,
but
really
back to Planetary.
Back to Planetary. It's hard to really explain this book. It's hard to sum up as well as hard to project where it's going, because I'm only an issue or two in, and it's still full of mystery. But you have this group of characters that are trying to figure out Earth's secret history, conspiracy theories behind, how things really played out and how things really happened. And I think you've got this one lady who's super strong, and this other guy who works with machines. So that's Donatello, and I guess the lady is Leonardo, and you've got this other guy who controls heat and cold. So I don't really have a comparable Ninja Turtle for that. So I guess just dip into the X-Men or something and find someone that fits that role. Iceman, I suppose. This is how I operate.
That's fine.
But just really, really interesting book, and I would encourage people that are looking for something a little bit more slower, a little bit denser, to take interest in Planetary. It's really interesting because I feel like Cassaday, visually, like I see a real strong connection between Cassaday and John David Hunt, the guy who's currently drawing the Wildstorm. Like they've both got that very clean art style going on, just simple lines, and it's just easy to look at. And it's just shocking that Cassaday's art is like 20 years old in this. It looks great. So that's me, turning off pools and reading Planetary. What about you, Mike?
I read a lot. I was on vacation for a week, and I read a lot of comic books. But one thing that I do want to talk about, because I read a lot of manga, but I dove into some Star Wars, and I think this is a serious dent. Nick laughed at me when I said this was a serious dent, but I read...
I put a big dent in this, Nick. Okay,
yeah,
let's hear.
I read Star Wars Volumes 1 through 3, Darth Vader 1 and 2, and Vader Down. So I basically wanted to read through the entire Vader Down saga, and then I started into Volume 3 of Star Wars. This is, Kieran Gillen and Jason Aaron on writing, John Cassaday, Mike Mayhew, Salvador LaRocca, Lennel Yu, a bunch of artists on this book, and I just want to say, holy shit, Star Wars. There's so much action, so much adventure. Like, I forget that Star Wars comics, like, they need to be as action-packed and exciting as the movies, but in my head, I'm like, no, the times between the movies are just down times for these characters, but that's bullshit. There's no way that's how you sell comic books. So I read through a lot of this. I really liked it. Like, I did not think I was going to be as into it as I ended up being. Like, I read the Poe Dameron series for a while and dropped it. But when we started to see more lightsabers show up in the book, and we saw Gracchus the Hutt, who is a character that shows up in Poe Dameron. So, like, way in the future, this character, Gracchus the Hutt, is also, like, still alive, still, like, kicking, still being a bad Hutt on giant, spindly, creepy legs. And then to see him in this Star Wars book, that was a lot of fun, like, for me. I also, as everyone has said, and everyone should, I love Aphra. She's so awesome. Like, she's got this unbelievable confidence that no matter what you think you've pulled on her, she's always going to escape. She's always going to get the better of you. Like, I love that like mentality. I love the way that she's written. I think Kieran Gillen, created this character. He did a fantastic job with her. And then to see Jason Aaron write her a little bit in the Star Wars series during the Rebel Jail arc, it was so good. I just want a book that is Sana and Leia and Aphra. I just want like a 4-issue miniseries of them having to get out of a bind, similar to what happened in Rebel Jail, because that was so much fun.
Bicycle, did you really just roll up to Aphra 15 minutes late with Starbucks?
I mean, yeah.
like, how many of us have been telling you this for how long?
Listen, I read Darth Vader Volume 1 a while ago, and then I reread it, just to make sure that I knew everything. And I just, I don't know, it just finally clicked as I was reading so much of her and reading Star Wars. It just, I had
She's
a very
like all your
good
favorite
Star Wars
things.
time. Yeah.
Tell us about how you just discovered Breaking Bad, Mike.
Listen, guys, you know what? Sometimes I take my time on things, and I binge, and I had a very good time. The one last thing I will say is Darth Vader is the meanest, barely kept together, angry, confident dad that I want to read more and more about. Like, I'm super hooked on the Darth Vader series just because it seems like he's barely got his shit together, but he has to be the scariest, meanest person ever. I love the way that Gillen has kept him in this very confident, very bold and angry, like, mentality like that you would expect out of Darth Vader in the movies. but yet he has screwed up and he has to get around all of these protocols.
He's got a chaperone.
and he's got a chaperone, which is the funniest thing I've ever seen. Like, the fact that they think that Darth Vader could be kept is the funniest thing to me, right? I love the way that he's like schemed a lot of things, and he's constantly used the Force as his little bit of luck, just like Anakin. And I hate to say this, but the prequels make sense when you start to read this book.
Wow.
Like, Darth Vader hasn't changed that much as a character, because Anakin Skywalker was a piece of garbage person who used the Force to his own advantage, and that's exactly what Darth Vader's doing. And I really like that. Like, they aren't trying to wholly acknowledge the prequels, but they still keep some of those character aspects. If you like study it from like a big picture way, I think that it all connects, and it kind of makes me happy that they aren't trying to throw away everything, you know? I don't know. It worked. I really enjoyed this.
Was Anakin born garbage, or was he made garbage?
Oh, God.
All right.
That's a whole other episode.
We'll do a mini-sode.
It's a whole other episode.
We'll do a mini-sode. Yes, we'll do. Okay.
Did you like how the annual #1 played into Rebel Jail? Because I thought that was brilliant. I mean, you see annuals just as a throwaway thing so many times, but I think that was Gillen who wrote the Star Wars annual #1. That was so smart. I love that issue. You're following nobody even remotely related to anything you know about Star Wars, and then they just rope it back in. And I can only imagine if you were reading that month to month, that must have been like a shock. It
was a really cool reveal in the trade as well, because the trade starts with the annual, and then you find out a character from that annual shows back up. It's so good. Like, I'm really happy with what they've done with the Star Wars comics. And again, I didn't think I was going to be as into it as I ended up being, so I'm very happy. I'm like going to keep reading this. I'm going to binge for the rest of this week on Star Wars. I'm very excited for it. But let's move on, because we could do a whole thing about Star Wars. As always, we could do 1,000 episodes about Star Wars. But let's talk about books that are coming out this upcoming week. Comic books are being released on June 13th, 2018. What are you both excited for? Let's start with you, Nick.
Well, I think we've already talked about me broadening my horizons and growing as a person in ways that are just completely unbelievable to the average human being.
Yeah.
And I'm going to extend that even further. So I have a Lion Forge book here. I know, it's crazy.
That's crazy.
I know. Orphans Volume #1. Unfortunately, it does involve me pronouncing Italian names, but we're going to try here. Written by Roberto Recchioni and drawn by Emiliano Mamucari. Sorry, guys. So I saw this volume 1 or 2 months back in previews, and I was like, you know what? This is a nice standalone book. Huge amount of pages, great price, interesting concept. I know nothing else, but let's try this. So this is a book that, as the preview summary goes, says, after a devastating attack from distant space leaves a large portion of Earth's population in terror and ruin, a band of children are groomed into a unit of perfect soldiers sent to the distant hostile planet to avert another horrific attack. But when they arrive, they discover dark secrets that Earth's government... I don't think this was spell checked. Would prefer remain secret. So basically, it's Ender's Game meets Starship Troopers with children. So it's got everything I love. It's standalone. I can get into this by it. You know, it's a nice price. It's a huge book. There's tales of reckless child endangerment. And people say children are the future. Why the future? Let's make them do the work now. Let's just get them in there and fighting our battles. So here they are on a distant planet. The art looks good. Government conspiracy. It's pretty much everything I'm interested in. This author is largely known, Recchioni, for doing Italian work for a publisher called Jura Editoriale, including a series called John Doe and Detective Dante. But he did recently pen The Crow, Memento Mori, which came out in March, which was a IDW collaboration with Edizioni BD, which is a Italian comic book publisher. So that's kind of cool. It took place in Rome, unsurprisingly. So yeah, it sounds fun. It is sort of just a big gamble. Let's just see what this is and see if it's good. But I'm always saying on the show, try new things, and also don't try new things. Stick to what you know. So I'm very proud to continue this mixed message that I've been spreading for years.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. What about you, Tia?
All right. Well, I am looking forward to Monstress number, 17, 18? Number 17, Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda. They're nominated for like 5 Eisner Awards this year. And I am really behind on this series. I probably need to get caught up after the second trade, which was like up through number 12, I think. So I'm really behind, but I am going to be on a plane to Charlotte this week, and so I'm going to have plenty of time to get caught up. And I just, the series is so beautiful and so exciting and dangerous and like dramatic, but not in a like, oh, it's so dramatic, it's more like, oh my god, like I can't stop reading this and I forget why I did stop reading it. Who knows? There's so many comics, and I think that I tend to, with books like this, I like to binge read, so I like to let them kind of pile up, and then like that can just kind of sometimes bite me in the ass because then I forget to read them again. So, comic industry, if you could just please adjust yourself to my reading preference, that would be great. And just like give me an arc at a time, that would make me happy. But it seems like 5 issues, that's like almost an arc, so that's enough saved up that I should probably like dive back in there and get really excited about all those Eisner noms.
Heck yeah.
How long has Monstress been running now? Because I get that, yes, it's an Image book and they take weird breaks, but I feel like that book's been going on for what, 3, 4? Not 4.
No,
3 years?
3.
Maybe more like 3. Okay. I think there's a misconception that Image books are inherently weird. I think some are weird, but there is like a quote unquote Image release schedule, which is an arc and then a break and then a trade and then a break and then the next arc starts. And so there's like a 3-month break technically between arcs that makes it seem like forever. And I don't know, which is why it's hard when you're like a trade waiter and then you're like, I have to start.
Then it's forever to you. Yeah.
It's like a million years. So I don't know. It's not perfect, but I don't want artists to die. So they should have some breaks.
I agree.
That being said, Image, I just want to shove this in here. Where's the old guard, Image? Where's the old guard?
Nick, we're not getting into that. We're not getting into that.
Mike, what did you read, or what are you looking forward to?
The old guard is going to come back, Nick. Greg Rucka said that they were taking a break until forever.
If the old guard takes the breaks that Black Magic took, I'll see you in 5 years. Okay?
Yeah, exactly. So for me this week, I'm very excited for By Night, number 1, by John Allison and Christine Larson. I'm not usually let down by Boom books, and this is the same writer who's on Giant Days, so like this book is probably going to be a winner, and Christine Larson's art is fucking incredible. So I'm really excited because the premise of this book sounds like 2 friends decide or accidentally stumble into another dimension, and then they decide, let's make a documentary and get filthy rich. But the other dimension is filled with monsters and magic and maybe a chance for a new life. So who says they even have to come back? I'm willing to take a chance on this book that I'm very, very certain is going to get me completely hooked. But yeah, this looks beautiful, and everything about this book sounds fantastic, so I have no reason to doubt that this book would be good at all. I don't know why I keep saying that, but it's very, very cool looking, and I'm very excited about it. I do want to quickly touch on...
Run?
I don't know. And if it's ongoing, so be it. John Allison has a fantastic track record as far as I'm concerned. His Giant Days is one of the most perfect books on the shelves. I do want to make one quick note before we go into the break. I'm very torn about the Magic Order number 1 because it sounds so cool. Except
you and so many people.
It's a Mark Miller book, and I'm just like, I don't know. I just don't know. So, all you listeners out there, if you do end up buying or reading this book, let me know what you think. Give me your very honest, harsh, critical opinion, because I'm very torn, like in a lot of ways about this book, because it sounds like everything I'd ever want in a comic book, but I know that I've been very disappointed by Mark Miller's promises in the past. So, someone let me know.
It looks pretty.
It looks very pretty. Anyways, we're going to go into a break. When we come back, we have a very special guest on the show. She's fantastic. You're going to love it, so stick around. On our show this week, we have a very special guest. Her name is Hope Nicholson. Hope, thank you so much for joining us on this show. This is a Kickstarter commissioned episode talking about all sorts of different stuff. But before we get into it, Hope, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how awesome you are?
A comics publisher based in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. I've also done some work with Dark Horse Comics, curating the collections The Secret Loves of Geek Girls and The Secret Loves of Geeks, as well as Margaret Atwood's Angel Catbird series. And I'm also Kickstarter thought leader. I'm actually not 100% sure that program still exists, but it basically means I help give advice and solve issues when comic book creators have things that come up in their Kickstarter campaigns.
And you're also an author.
Yes, right. I wrote a history book, The Spectacular Sisterhood of Superwomen, which analyzes the history of female characters in comics from the 1930s through to the present day.
You know you're awesome when you have to leave things off your CV. That's when you know you've made it.
Well, I should probably leave the thought leader thing off because now they have official comics. No one's told me one way or the other, so.
Well, you've done it, so it still could go on the CV. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that is a very super legit list. I think that makes you the most legitimate person that's been on this show. So we'll give you that award. How about that? If the Kickstarter thing isn't real, at least you've got that from this show. But yeah, so we're here to talk about basically like the history of comic books, specifically geared towards women. We had someone reach out to us from the Kickstarter who commissioned this episode to talk about how over the years, comic books have, started to drift more and more in the direction of focusing not just on, white male demographic, but like a broader spectrum. But like, there's still a lot of work to be done. But nonetheless, like, how have you, as someone who's written an entire book about this, how do you see that progression move from, the early 30s and, earlier than that, maybe when comic books were in their very, very infancy, to now, where we're seeing kind of more and more books being brought to a more diverse spectrum of readers?
I mean, I think a lot of the issue that happens when people think about comic book history is that they think it's a straight line progression, that comics were really bad and that now they're better than they've ever been.
Sure.
And unfortunately, that's not the case. It's really more of a up and down zigzag line in terms of both how the industry has treated creators as well as how fans have been geared towards. So women readers, especially at the beginning of comics, it was kind of an open playing field. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was, on the one hand, there was the sex comics that were in pulps, and those were very, very much geared towards just like male readers and gentlemen's clubs. But on the other hand, the most popular comics were kids comics, and those were fully non-gendered. So both boys and girls read them pretty evenly. And then when the superhero comics came out, those too were pretty non-gendered. So if you look at the letter columns back in those old comics, you see that there's a lot of women and a lot of men writing into the comics, which is really interesting. Then things started to split off into more gendered comics. So women got romance comics, boys got war comics, and you still saw really good sales from the female readership, but things were definitely changing to make it less of an open playing field. And then, of course, when the romance comics kind of dissolved, and that happened at a time when comics had been moving from the newsstands into hobby shops. So what we now know as comic shops, but at the time they were kind of just either head shops or like guys selling comics out of their basement kind of thing. Right. It really hit the death knell for female readership in comics, and that lasted for about 30 years. I'd say, and only when the distribution's starting to get a bit more even now, like we're not seeing that many comics on newsstands, but the internet is like the world's biggest newsstand. So webcomics have always been very much enjoyed by everyone of any gender, and now that a lot of more books are being sold in bookstores, that's been a huge plus as well. And of course, the rise of superhero movies has only helped kind of the spread of gender equality in terms of readership.
It seems like, so the person who kickstarted or who commissioned this episode from the Kickstarter, I know very well because she's my mom. And so we'll just, and so, I mean, my uncle's my uncle's entire like garage is full of comics, and they grew up as kids reading comics. And my mom feels like there was a certain point when she was chased out of the space, and it was partly because they were sort of for kids, but also for boys. And so it's interesting that it's what we talk about the space as this kind of like abstract comics space, but it sounds like it also was quite literally about being chased out of the space where you can actually buy comics.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, due to safety concerns, not a lot of women are going to feel comfortable going to some guy's old moldy basement, and not only that, being subjected to like who knows what kind of language and conversation. And I mean, there was still the type of gatekeeping nerdity that still exists a bit today, with guys being huge about collecting and about knowing every single thing about every single issue and every creator, and women more enjoying it, doing things with it. Like, there's a reason why a lot of most popular girls' comics were ones that asked the female readers to send in designs, because by and large, when women engage in fandom, I mean, and this is a generalization, of course, not all women do this, and some women are collectors as well, but they like to do something with it. So being able to create a comic, I think that was cute to female readers, but just collecting the comics and knowing a lot of stats was not really of interest.
I saw recently someone talking about the differences, and I think the terms that they used were curatorial and transformative. And I actually would put out there that connoisseurial seems like maybe a better word than curatorial, because curatorial to me implies a real engagement, kind of like what you were just saying, whereas when you're connoisseurial, you literally are just like memorizing the stats and collecting the things, and it seems like, I don't know, I wonder if curatorial is a little closer to the sort of transformative, which I think is another word for fan fiction, basically.
Yeah, the transformation content is usually connected to fan fiction, fan art, although I feel like fan art's always been pretty gender, like, on both sides. Like,
yeah,
I've never noticed a really strong gender division in terms of who does fan art.
Also, like, look, unless you invented Spider-Man, if you like, I don't care if you're hired to work on Spider-Man and you're like sanctioned by Marvel to draw Spider-Man, like it's fan fiction, it's fan art.
Oh, for sure. Like, I feel like all modern comics for Marvel and DC are just grown-up kids doing fan art, and right. I like that. Like, it's very enjoyable, but the comics have been dead for a long time, you know? Like, you're writing things about characters that premiered 80 years ago. It's not the same series anymore. So all it can be is kind of an echo of something that started way back then.
Right.
But I think your idea of taking the term curatorial away from kind of the male gendered way of processing comics is interesting, because I think it makes sense, because a lot of women are involved in the archive fields, in information sciences, in libraries, and that's where you see a lot of the curation, a lot of the archival, a lot of the collections.
Right.
It's just on a one-on-one personal basis. You don't see a lot of women with huge, long boxes cluttering up their basement.
Yeah. So I guess my next question about that is, like, specifically around like the collection side, is like, do you think that the rise of like the superhero genre out of the comics code and stuff like that kind of forced like a gender bias, given that those types of books typically lean towards like male readers?
No, I feel like superhero books were definitely the books that were not specifically gendered, especially the Marvel ones when they came out in the Silver Age. There was a lot of guys who came from writing romance comics who merged into writing superhero comics, and they brought that same kind of, well, let's face it, melodrama to the superhero comics,
totally.
Which made them so enjoyable. And again, if you look at the letter pages, even in the Silver Age, you see a lot of women writing in. I'd say the more male-gendered comics were things like the war comics, and the horror comics too, to a great degree, especially when Warren Comics came out with, Vampirella and all those fun comics. But unfortunately, superhero comics did become male-gendered mostly because of the industry, because there was not a lot of women who could feel comfortable accessing the content once they left the newsstand.
Right.
Oh, I think that it's really interesting to put romance and superheroes in the same idea, because I mean, you really are dealing with the same kind of melodrama and also sentimentality really in superhero comics that you see in romance comics. And there's this idea that sentimentality is somehow false or contrived, but really, like, so the idea of sentimentality in literature and also in behavior is, it's almost like the thing that you're feeling is so intense that you need a prescribed set of behaviors and like a script in order to express it and interact with other people surrounding this really intense dramatic feeling that you have. And that's kind of more what the sentimental is, when it's not, people have like an idea that it's like a Hallmark greeting card. But I think that, you know, there's so many, as you say, Hope, melodramatic themes in both of those kind of books. And, you know, but you would never hear someone describe superhero books as sentimental. I mean, unless they were being really critical.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think there are elements of the unreal in superhero comics that go beyond just the fact that they have superpowers and they can fly and they can fight bad things. But the idea that all of their emotions are kind of heightened up to this nth degree. And when you read it, like you read X-Men, you're like, wow, this is very dramatic. There's a lot of love affairs and people leaving each other and deaths and all these things that are kind of Grey's Anatomy-ish. But we're aware of it. Like, no one reads it and is like, yes, this is what real life is like. This is what real people's relationships are like. Mm-hmm. But it's heightened in a way that not only can we enjoy it, but we can feel a little bit distant from it. Because sometimes when things are too real, they're also too painful for us to watch and process.
I can't read I Kill Giants without, you know, feeling real bad about everything. That's a very sad book.
When I read I Kill Giants, I feel bad that I don't cry, and I think everyone's judging me.
Oh, that's okay. I'm not judging you, I promise.
Okay. We also, Mike is our resident X-Men feelings guy.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've regularly called out the X-Men for basically being a daytime soap opera many, many times, to the point where it's almost frustrating. Like, I want a little bit of realism, but I realize we're far, 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 far beyond any chance of hope for that, which is why you get, like, every once in a while you get a little mini-series or something that's nice that has a real-life kind of reflection in it, but on the whole, it's just way out there. You know, Nightcrawler being a priest who died, went to heaven, came back to life, only to realize that it was not that bad, but everything's terrible. I don't know. Like, we're never going to get a real life story about characters like that. I'm totally fine with it.
I mean, you get some. Like, I thought the Earth X series was a really great way to explore the heroes on a more personal, intimate level, but it also felt too raw. Like, I was reading it and I'm like, wow, I'm really depressed reading this because a lot of the characters are kind of just acting like real people. So...
Hope, when you were doing research for this topic, did you get a sense that women who were still creating comics even during this period where it was more male dominated, did you get the sense that they felt like, I'm doing this thing for womankind, or were they just like, I'm here making my comics?
It's a good question. Definitely the underground comics creators like Trina Robbins, and the whole crew around the Tits and women's comics type of area were very aware that it was a feminist revolution, and it was intended as such. Mm-hmm. But prior to that, the women that worked in comics, there was a few artists, a few writers, a lot of color artists. And unfortunately, the reason why there was a lot of women working in color is because they were related often to the actual artists, and color art was seen as kind of a lesser form. It was just kind of busy work. So you'd be like, well, okay, so-and-so's girlfriend needs a job. Here, you can make them a color artist. But a lot of times they actually went on to be more successful and more prolific in the industry than their partners, which I always find kind of funny. Not a lot of people know of John Severin's work, but they definitely know of his sister Marie Severin's color work.
Oh,
I mean, this is basically true in, I think, every creative field, I would imagine.
That people's partners get busy work to do and then end up succeeding? I'm not sure. Possibly. But so, that said, like, a lot of times the women who are working those roles didn't, from what I've talked about with Trina, is that they didn't view it as being transgressive or anything like that. A lot of times they kind of just went with the flow of things, and try to cause as little waves as possible just to get by, which, I think all of us do every day, unfortunately. But it was definitely even more so then because you couldn't risk losing your job.
It strikes me as really, I don't know, just like tying this back to what we were talking about in terms of like women readers being kicked out of the space at a certain point. Like, if you were a dude who was casually interested in comics, it seems like it would have been fairly easy for you to continue being casually into comics throughout this period. Whereas if you were a woman who was casually interested in comics and then all of a sudden you had to go to some creepy dude's basement to buy them, you're probably going to lose interest.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the big reason why a lot of things faded out for women. Not only was the distribution different, though, is that a lot of times the romance genre was getting a little stale for people to read. Like, we talk about heightened emotions, and that's why romance comics were really popular. But they were also always written by men, and they were pretty bad. Like, they were very cheesy, and they could be very fun to read nowadays. But at the time, people reading it were, seeing really great authentic storylines on television, for example. Mm-hmm. And storylines in comics, by comparison, were seeming really hackneyed and cheesy. So there was even less of an incentive to go into comic book stores when the comics there really weren't serving your needs anymore.
Right. And so this shift that we've seen now with webcomics and digital comics, and I mean, we can even start talking about Kickstarter maybe, and the idea that you don't necessarily need the blessing of some big publisher to make your work and put it in front of people. It seems like it's a lot easier now for someone to be a casual reader of comics, which, I know we like to pretend that we're all like dedicated, diehard, like 4 colors run through our veins, but I think the industry really needs casual readers too.
Yeah, I think so for sure. And that's the problem with superhero comics, is that they're so serial that you can't be a casual reader. Like, right. There's no chance of that. Either you get every single issue or you don't read them. So that's kind of a weird market. The reason earlier I read the Vision series for Marvel is because I haven't read Marvel in a few years, and I was able to just jump in and read the series and not have to know a lot about what was going on in the wider universe, and it was great. Mm-hmm. So I definitely think casual readers are huge, and it's the reason too why original creator-owned content does really well, like why Saga does so well, why Wicked and the Divine does so well, is because people can start from the beginning, from a finite point, and finish it off, until the end, hopefully.
And you can binge read. Like, nobody consumes media on a serial basis anymore.
Well, I mean, like, the comic industry is still doing pretty good in monthly sales, like definitely not nearly as good as it used to, but enough that there is still like this core.
Right. But I mean, it feels very rickety to rely on those people, and they have to replace themselves at some point. And in order to do that, you've got to get new people to become diehard readers. I don't know. I feel like we have to come to terms at some point with the fact that people want to read a whole book, like, at once.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely for the single volume graphic novels. It's basically almost all that I read now, so yeah. I'm a huge fan of them. I guess it'd be great if serial comics had less of a presence than they do in the comic industry, and more people were doing standalones. And I think eventually that will happen, but these people are, for being fans, very reluctant to give up. But eventually they'll die. So not that I want them to by any means. Like, not all serial hardcore readers are bad people. But
no, of course.
It will be nice to see the industry shift and change and become a bit more like the book industry.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to ask. Do you think that something like the book industry or the prose industry works better for I guess casual readers? I mean, it seems kind of obvious that yes, I think it does, because you can just pick up a novel and then you're good to go. And if you're going to continue to read longer books, like they're at least sequential and easy to find or whatever, but where compared to floppies. But like, do you think that would, I mean, to kind of circle back a little bit towards the topic, do you think that would make it easier for people of, all genders, not just these diehard, typically probably white male readers?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the biggest surge of new demographics and readership that we've seen is with young female readers, and a lot of that is because of the work that Scholastic and other companies that are in the book market have been doing to gear themselves towards those readers. And they have discovered that, wow, girls actually really like reading comics if you make them in specific formats. So a lot of times these single volume trades or these series that are very clearly labeled are really big. Like my niece is 8 right now, and like she's obsessed with Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which is kind of not quite comics, not quite an illustrated book, but she loves having the complete series. And you can see even on the spines, it's super easy to pick up 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, in a way that, like, how are you supposed to do that with superhero comics when there's no way to figure out what comes next?
Yeah.
I know. I stopped reading pretty much all superhero comics when Marvel went back to their like 1,150 billion numbering, and I just was like, I'm out.
Legacy numbering.
I'm out. Done.
Yeah.
It's really too hard. Like when I was really, really into serial comics, which was basically in early 20s through mid 20s. Like before that, I would just buy whatever I could get at flea markets, and after that, I mostly just bought graphic novels. But there was about a 6-year period where I had my pull list and I was getting comics every week. And the only way I would know how to know what to get was to go to these like really extensive reading lists that were usually created by pirates, but they were obsessed with telling you what order you should read things in and pick things up with.
Oh, yeah.
So it was really helpful for my pull list as well. But, like, it shouldn't be that way. Like, that's an awful way to run a company.
We make it so hard for people to buy the comics.
Yeah. Which I think that kind of explains the solid success that we've seen with publishers like, Black Mask or Vault or even Image, obviously, like Image, we just, you talked about Wicked and Divine, where there's just like a single series, that's all you need to read, and it's going to be collected and it's going to be clearly labeled with the number of volumes that you need to read. None of this like crossover event stuff, which still happens every once in a while in indie comics, but on the whole, like most books coming from non-big 2 publishers, or big 4 publishers at least, are typically just standalone. You just read it, and those books usually do really well, specifically in graphic novel sales, which I think like kind of clearly shows that that's the direction people should be thinking about.
For sure. The only problem is, while that is a thing that often a lot of us say, especially as we read comics, because that's our own personal interest, when you look at the sales chart, I think they could do even better if they wanted to, if they integrated more with, the audiovisual industry in that. But by no means do I think that it's time for them to be discounted just yet.
Right.
It's really interesting to me, though, that whenever you have a conversation about diversity, diverse audiences, getting new readers, like it always comes back to the distribution and the methods of buying comics. And it makes me wonder, and I'm sure this isn't true, but Hope, you've kind of like been in the archives, so you probably have a better sense of this. Like when things changed from the newsstand to the comic shop, was there like a conscious, we're making this a boys club now? Or was that just a perk for them?
Yeah, I think that's basically it. Like, I don't think or malicious intent when these changes in demographics happen, but there is a significant ignorance. And so people aren't looking around being like, where are the people? And like, let's not discount the fact that women's comics went up and down and up and down, but comics geared towards people of color has always been very, very down, and only has been on an upswing even in the last 10 years or so. And that's a demographic shift that's been great to see, and definitely has a lot of things to do with accessibility, but also, as we were talking about Kickstarter and webcomics, with the accessibility of getting material out there easier and getting more creator-owned content out there, and not having publishers as a gatekeeper has been making that shift really significant.
I also am wondering, in like from a creator standpoint, you know, obviously you don't have to go to art school to learn how to be a comic book artist, but it just seems like the other thing that the internet has brought is like YouTube tutorials and, you know, just like even the methods of learning the craft seem a lot more accessible to a much broader group of people than before the internet.
Yeah, especially social media. Just being able to kind of use Twitter, for example, as your water cooler to connect with other creators who are coming up on your level and to also meet people who could be potential fans of your work is something that we've never had before. Like, we've never had this open market to just put your work out there and see what response it gets. And I mean, it's a very, very crowded market, which make it really hard for stuff to get out there. But at the same time, it is a lot more fair than anything else we've ever had. And that goes for learning as well and talking to people. Like, I've seen a lot of creators put something up and be like, I don't know how to use this stylus on my tablet. And other people pipe in really quick with tips and tricks or different hardware to buy. And that's something that they wouldn't have been able to do before unless they were going to conventions and just like bugging people with questions all the time.
Right. I mean, yeah, I've seen stuff like that. Like, I think I saw you post something the other day. Like, I can't talk about this, but I need someone to write an 8-page story. Is anybody out there? And then the number of responses that flooded in is like, it's really cool to see that happen like almost instantaneously, just to get creators together. It's very, very cool.
It's really remarkable. I don't use social media as much as I used to, but definitely when I need something in a pinch, people are so supportive in tweeting out calls for submissions and tweeting out like questions for people. Anything that could potentially get a struggling creator not only exposure but also payment. People are really happy to kind of put their own feelings aside and retweet it and push it to make sure that everyone has access to these opportunities.
Yeah. I mean, to kind of go off of that a little bit, I mean, you worked on a couple books. You worked on a few books, I should say, you know, that have been collaborative efforts. Like something like The Secret Lives of Geeks was a bunch of people put together. You know, how did something like that come together? Were you commissioned by Dark Horse to say, hey, you know, find people, put this book together? Or was it just like a mutual love of a couple different things and you made a book? Like, what was that all about? Or how did that all come together, I guess, is the better question.
Yeah, so it's kind of varies. So The Secret Lives of Geek Girls was originally done through Kickstarter. So I had a finished product already in hand, but I want to get out to a wider marketplace. And the way the distribution works is that I'm limited. So like on Kickstarter, yeah, you might be able to sell a few thousand copies, which is great and sustainable if you can keep doing that, but it doesn't grow you that much compared to if you get in a bookstore and you can sell suddenly tens of thousands of copies just as easily.
Right.
So having Dark Horse attached to the second print run of The Secret Lives of Geek Girls was really great. And I auditioned a few different publishing companies during that time period. And yeah, Dark Horse for me was the best fit at that time. So when I wanted to do a sequel, The Secret Lives of Geeks, which was an all-gender edition, I approached them as well and said, look, let's just skip the Kickstarter and let's just do it directly. So in that case, yeah, I worked on kind of a ideal list and ran it past the editor there. We kind of worked in collaboration. His name isn't on the book, but I think Daniel Chabon, who's at Dark Horse, is definitely as integral to the success of the books as I am, for sure. And they gave me money that I then just kind of filtered to the creators.
Okay.
So it's kind of funny to be working on a book for a year and a half, 2 years, and post-advance come in, you know, a year later. So a lot of people think I'm making a lot of money of these anthologies, but in truth, a publisher's job is really not to make money. It's just to filter money from one source to another.
Gotcha.
I wanted to ask you about Bedside Press. You know, because you know the struggles of things from both the perspective of the curator or the editor of the anthology, but also from the publisher's perspective, because Bedside Press has done some anthologies, and if we're going to start talking about diversity or continue talking about diversity, it seems like one thing that Bedside Press has really striven to do is put books out there that maybe would not have support from other publishers.
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate. I think the best example of that is a book that I didn't do on Kickstarter, but I just kind of did a few pre-sales and then funded it out of pocket, which was Love Beyond Body, Space, and Time. And that's actually my only prose book to date. And it's a collection of Indigenous LGBT sci-fi stories. And a lot of times when I tell people about this, it's either, wow, that's really amazing because we don't see a lot of Native people in the future, and because there's not a lot of information on LGBT and two-spirited Native and Indigenous people. And then on the flip side, the other response I get from well-meaning liberal people is, wow, don't you think that's too much stuff to put in one book?
Oh my God.
Like too niche, too specific? And I'm like, do you think that there's not gay Native people? Do you think that they don't want sci-fi and fantasy? Like, I don't understand why, if you have a few descriptors in front of a thing, suddenly you think it's too big. That's the point of comfort.
Also, why is that book only for gay Native people who like sci-fi? Like, hey, read outside of your identity maybe once or twice.
For sure. Like, I really think the book is good, and a lot of people who've responded to it are people who don't fall into that identity matrix, that cross-section. But they're really good fantasy and sci-fi stories. And who wants to read about the same, like, colonizing a white guy, going on a spaceship and, like, beating up aliens? Like, it gets boring and repetitive at the least.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so I feel like I've seen people talk about that book also in an academic context, or it ends up on a lot of professor syllabus for, I don't know, what kind of classes do you see engaging with that book?
It's been picked up by a few courses. I'm always very excited when I see that, especially in Canada. A lot of times it gets put onto sexually diverse literature courses. Sometimes onto Indigenous literature courses as well, but I've seen mostly that it goes on under there. A few rare times I've seen it on fantasy and sci-fi courses syllabus, but I'd say by and large, kind of the structure is courses that deal with LGBT literature, and then courses that deal with Indigenous literature, followed by a course that deal with fantasy and sci-fi. So
I would not be mad if I had to read a sci-fi book as part of one of my classes in college. I would be very happy about that, I think. I mean, I went to school for, like, computers, so it was, like, a totally different thing. Maybe other people are reading fantasy and sci-fi normally, but, like, if I took a class and they were like, oh, and we're going to read this, LGBT sci-fi book about Indigenous people, like, I would be totally blown away. So thumbs up to those professors out there.
Listen, liberal arts majors may not ever have any money, but we got to read fun stuff in college.
Yeah.
It's true. And I mean, speaking of that, because I have a small history in academia and schooling, I always try as a publisher to make my books as cheap as possible to students. So a lot of times I was frustrated when I was doing my comic book research as a student, and all of these old comics were not accessible. So I couldn't even read them, study them. All I could do was read what other people have written about a few comics that they had read. And these are specifically, about the 1940s Canadian comics, which were my first foray into publishing, was reprinting, restoring, and publishing them. But then at that point, no one could buy the books. Like, students, if they found a copy, they were like $40 each, because I couldn't afford a full print run. So I managed to cut costs and do a print-on-demand version, and suddenly now students who want to read the books can pick up a copy for $10 and have access to it. So keeping in mind that students don't have this unlimited supply of money, and that you can't take advantage of them just because they have to read something for a course, is something that's really important for me when I'm doing these books.
That's awesome. I think, like, that also makes it accessible to people just lower income in general, right? I mean, that's groundbreaking as far as I'm concerned. That's awesome.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's some that you can't do anything about, like a full color graphic novel that's a large size. There's really no way to cut a lot of costs there without literally going to the negative each sale. But definitely on the prose books and on the black and white graphic novels, there's a lot of ways to make it available to people at lower costs.
Do you engage much with librarians, or we were talking about archivists earlier? like, I don't know, you seem very plugged into the academic side of comics, and I'm curious about how much, there are comics librarians, and I don't know how much of a tight-knit circle is that?
I know some of them for sure, especially when I was doing a lot of my archival research into the old comics. So I kind of am familiar with a bit of the community of comics academia and comic librarians. I wish I was more plugged in to the general library sphere, because those are the people that you want to promote your books to younger readers. For example, if you have all ages books, and you want them to kind of champion your books in general to the library systems, because that's what gives you the greatest access to the most amount of readers. But I don't have a lot of access to those avenues right now. But it's definitely something that, as I go on publishing, I make it my priority to do more reach outs and to connect with more librarians. Like this year at TCAF, I took part in Librarian Educator Day, and we did these really quick speed dating type of things where a group of different 10 librarians would come to your table. You tell them about all your books, and then they'd ring a bell, and another group of librarians would come. And that was amazing. It was so great.
That's awesome.
And I wish I could do more stuff like that, like go to ALA, the American Library Association annual meeting, or the Canadian Library Association. Stuff like that is really on my agenda to grow my business in the next few years.
At what point in the history of comics, because we sort of talked about where comics were accessible on their zigzag timeline, at what point did comics start showing up in libraries, and like when did that start becoming a place where you could actually find comics or have people champion your comic books?
I mean, that's really interesting, because I can only go by personal anecdotal information at this point, which was when I was a kid and I wanted to get comics from the library. The metadata was often inaccurate. So they would say, for example, especially because I know we both enjoy ElfQuest, they would have like 12 volumes of ElfQuest. Then you'd put an order for every single one. You'd find out that they only had volume 4, actually.
Right.
So that was a big issue. And there was no actual separated section. And it's definitely gotten better, especially in the kids' graphic novel sections. But I find a lot of times I go to the library still, and I see things like, hey, maybe Saga shouldn't be in the kids section.
Oh,
I get
God.
it. But yeah, this is highly inappropriate.
My local library has that problem too. It's like, because there's still this idea that all comics are for kids. Like you see, and I'm like, have you cracked this book open? Or you don't even have to open it. Look at the cover of The Walking Dead. It is not for children.
Yes. Yeah, I think younger librarians are really changing the system in that regard. Mm-hmm. And the other big thing, too, that's helping to change the library system are the library comic festivals. So things like TCAF, of course, which is held in the Toronto Public Library. I have an event as well in the Winnipeg Public Library, are things where you can really get the librarians more engaged with the creators or with the discussions. I've even been doing panels where I'm having librarians go through their catalogs and recommend things to kids. And not only is that great for the audience, but it's also really great for the librarians to refresh their knowledge of what they have and what they have access to.
I feel like this all has an implied kind of gender slant to it, these things that we're talking about, like, you know, because I think that you really think of librarians and young all of this is kind of goes back to, you know, these seem to be more predominantly woman-filled spaces. And I don't know, it's almost, I feel bad because it's like, dudes, do you know that there's all these things that you miss out on? Because I don't know, it just
as a
finish
dude,
my thought, Mike.
As a dude, I absolutely agree with you. Like, I really didn't take advantage of my local library until very recently, and I'm like kicking myself for it. Like, I'm almost 30 years old, and I didn't step into a library like on an official capacity to get a book until I was like 28. Like, that's wrong. And it's like an amazing resource.
Too. Like, what did you read when you were a kid?
Well, that's the thing.
Did you have money, like books?
Well, I did a lot of like I wasted a lot of money just like buying books when I should have been, you know, buying food in college. And on top of that, it was just like, you know, I would swap books with a lot of people, or I would borrow books from friends whose parents did, you know, have money for books and things like that. Or, I would just read the same things over and over when I was younger. Like, I think I read the Harry Potter series probably like 20 times when I was in high school, just because, like, that was a book series that I owned, and those were mine, and I was very certain of it, or like one other book series, until I really got into comics and started to read more and more. And, I think like you were talking about before, like the list of books that you would get on like pirate sites and stuff like that, like at a time, that's what I was reading, was like pirated comic books on the internet, because I didn't have any money. But like, I should have been just going to the library. That would have solved all of my problems. I wouldn't have to like seek out all these weird, goofy websites and things like that to find things. Instead, I could have been using these utilities that like exist for the purpose of exactly what I was doing, just to try to enrich myself and read more things. It's a whole problem. And it just because there was no like prejudice against it, it's just I didn't use it.
Yeah, no, the thing is though, as me and Tia were saying, even if you went to those libraries, then you're not going to see a lot of comics then.
Yeah.
Like, there wasn't a huge amount. And definitely there would be gaps. And so you'd probably still have to go to the pirate sites anyways to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, yeah.
So their libraries are a great resource, but we still have to kind of be on top of libraries and tell them what we need and what they should be doing. So a lot of people who engage in libraries are really important, because libraries are also stretched thin. Like, I don't know about you, but I work for the government here, and part of our job is monitoring libraries, and they have so little money that even saying things like, well, they should know a lot more about comics, it's like, well, they're also trying really hard just to keep afloat. Some are trying, but it's really tough when the whole system is also stacked against them.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're speaking from like the Canadian side. I think the American side is the same, if not worse,
even
in some
more
places.
Dire, yeah.
But hey, we're trying. That's the thing. Everyone should be out there writing your senators, get money to the libraries. I don't know how that works. We'll find a proper channel to figure that out. I promise.
One other thing that I thought would be interesting to talk to you about, Hope, specifically, is older women in comics. And we were talking a little before we got recording about the range of ages that you had contribute to Secret Loves. And part of what started this whole commission episode is my mom getting into comics again as, later in life, and feeling like she didn't really see herself anywhere. I mean, I always keep a list whenever I find any older women in comics doing anything besides being a grandma, so I can tell her about them. But it seems like there are few creators that are her age, and I don't know, like, could you talk a little bit about the landscape of that and bringing a diverse range of ages to the contributors for Secret Loves?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that until we started talking about it before the show, I hadn't thought about that demographic. And when I kind of thought about it for a minute, I'm like, yeah, there isn't a lot of content geared towards older readers, especially like older female readers. Like, how am I going to get my grandma into comics, for example? And a lot of that is also, there's technical aspects, like things would need to be larger print, lettering would need to change, things like that comics are not terribly good. Like, I don't know if you know about this, but in terms of accessibility, comics are pretty bad.
Yeah.
Like, there's very few comics that are transferred to other mediums where people with print disabilities can read them, for example. Some are, like, there are some places that have been able to transcribe them so that people can use readers to read it out, but by and large, that's one part of the difficulty. And the other part, of course, is that there's not a lot of older women making comics. So doing Secret Loves of Geek Girls, it was really important for me to have a wide range of ages. So both Margaret Atwood and Trina Robbins contributed, both of them in their 70s. And then we also had younger contributors around, our youngest being 16 years old. And everyone's writing about love and romance. And you're reading it, and there isn't a lot of difference. Like, Margaret's talking about how she loved like dumb Tommy, like playing with guns when she was like a little girl, and
I love her comic.
Female friends, and how she loved reading comics, but her brother would always like steal them off her and stuff like that. And Trina Robbins is talking about how she has a crush on like Peter Capaldi on Doctor Who, and how she like for men in the streets. It's really, to me, it feels so reassuring when I read those, because I know that I don't have to be scared of the future. Like,
Mm-hmm.
things go on, your life goes on, and you're still going to be the same person in some ways that you are now.
It's really terrifying. And I mean, I feel, no, it's true. They're like, men have all sorts of older male role models and stories and narratives and scripts that they can look to and be like, yeah, okay, like I can like settle into that. But like, we have nothing. We have none of that. And I agree. I love those stories from Secret Loves, and I bet that's a big part of it, is just to know that, you know, you still have your sense of humor and your interests and your feelings when you're, you know, aging.
Yeah, we need to be able to look forward and kind of in the future, and not only support old creators, which a lot of people, you know, poo-poo that, because a lot of people say things like younger creators are the ones who know what's new and what's hip and what's now. And sure, that's important. It's really important to bring new creators into the world. And also, as we're seeing, especially with a lot of these older creators who no longer are able to sustain themselves, who are getting physical impairments that can prevent them from writing or drawing, we also have to figure out a way, like this is a much, much bigger issue, to support them in some ways so that people don't have to do GoFundMe so they're not living out of their van anymore.
Right.
Yeah. And also, I feel like, you know, when we constantly say younger creators are the ones who know where it's at, it's like, does that become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Do we give people permission to just check out and not keep their point of view current when we say stuff like that? Because A, that does not track with many of the older people that I know. And B, like, I don't know. I just feel like that is a weird cultural thing, and it seems like we're missing out on the perspective that older people have. They live in the world just like anyone else.
It is very interesting because it's also painting all older people with the same brush, and like there are still some dinosaurs in comics who've been doing the same comics the same way for the last 40 years. But I think of John K. Snyder, for example, who I worked with on the Fashion in Action reprint. Not only is he, you know, super into the style that he was doing in the 80s, but he's thinking of all these ways to make it current, and he's looking at all these Instagram models and all these current things, and it's a really neat way to perhaps with current things. And I think a lot of artists would like to have that opportunity, but it's scary to think about branching into new styles when, to be honest, you're not sure if people even want that, if you're going to lose your current fan base, if people will make fun of you. So I'm always really proud of John for kind of taking those steps and being very supportive of newer creators as well.
I feel like we've tapped into this like aspect of diversity that needs to be mapped out more. We should really like fix this problem.
I think it'd be great to get an anthology that's able for the older reader to read and make it interesting and to their point of view. And that would be a cool anthology. If someone wants to put it together, I would definitely throw money at it.
Well, cool. Well, I hate to cut this conversation off because this is fantastic, but we are running out of time, running out of tape, however you want to call it. So to wrap up here, Hope, thank you so much for being on the show. You know, where can people find you on the internet? What should they read that you've edited or written? All that jazz.
Yeah, I mean, you can read whatever you want of stuff I've done, but you can see me at Hope Nicholson on Twitter, Hope Nicholson on, well, not on Facebook. Don't follow me on Facebook, please. But Bedside Press on, well, there's always some people who try to, like, add you as a friend. You're like, but you're not. Like, I don't know you. I'm sorry. But Bedside Press is my publishing company, and it has Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, website, all that cool stuff.
Very cool. Well, you can follow the rest of I Read Comic Books on Twitter. You can follow Nick at Death Star Plans. You can follow Tia at Portrait of Mad Max, spelled the cool French way. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Rappin, and you can follow the show at IRCB Podcast, where we retweet stuff and post polls like the one we did today. What is Miss Marvel's favorite ice cream flavor? I picked some very weird ones. I'm sorry. You can also check out our Goodreads group, where we have weekly threads. This week, people are talking about an old thread, the best and worst dressed of comic book characters, and it's a lot of fun. Plus, we're reading a really cool book this month for our book club, Nimona, and that's amazing.
Yeah, Nimona's pretty good.
Yeah.
Chiming in.
Our website is ircbpodcast.com, and you can find all the episodes, our pronunciation guide for creators in the industry. We have merch. Please
That's
rate.
Really good idea.
Yeah.
I know that you guys did that.
yeah, if you have any you want to contribute, let us know.
Okay, cool.
Please rate the show and subscribe. It helps us to reach more listeners. You can email the show at ircb@destroythesybe.org.
Infinity Shred does all the music for the show. They're the very best band in the universe. Xander is a very cool guy. He gives very good high fives and hugs. When you get to know him, he'll give you a good hug. He also edits the show, and he's great. I want to say thank you to Tia and Nick and Hope. Thank you so much for being on the show. This has been super, super cool. We really should have you back. Once we get that older people anthology put together, we can, come back together and have a discussion about it. So until next time, you listeners, you're the best. Go read comic books, try something new, support creators, and be friendly to each other. That's all we need in comics. It's just more friendliness.